Join me in thanking the Lord for your courageous, faith-filled pastor. And I ran for Congress 3 times against Dick Gebhardt. He was the position before Nancy Pelosi, right? And so it was the, I think, the 5th most expensive congressional race. He drained the Democrat leader's victory fund, spent over $9 million against little old me. And we got the experience of having the newspaper saying negative things and the TV and the radio and everything. We didn't win, came close, but he spent so much money that his party members voted him out of his minority seat position. And so he then dropped out of Congress. So we didn't get in, but we helped retire him. But I did experience what it's like to be under fire. And so that's why I have extra special respect for your pastor, Paul Vanoy. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Arthur Schlesinger gave a quote: "History is to the nation as memory is to the individual." Have you ever met an individual who has lost their memory? Maybe they have Alzheimer's, they forgot who they are, they forgot who you are. Guess what? We have national Alzheimer's. Here we are, the freest country the planet has seen, and we forgot how we got here. And so we need to get our memory back. Do you know there's a sales technique? And if I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I would do is say negative things about the toothpaste you are currently using. You're still using that old stuff. It'll eat the enamel off your teeth. Ooh, you're repulsed by it. Now I got you into the neutral. You're sort of open-minded. What are all the toothpastes out there? And then I give you my pitch for this tartar control breath freshener. And so what do? They apply this to schools. And it's a communist tactic called deconstruction, where they say negative things about the founders of a country. They took land from Indians, they sold people into slavery, and the students are repulsed by them. Now you got the kids into the neutral. It's sort of open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there nowadays? Then you can give them your pitch for the LGBT or socialism or Islam or whatever. And we see Europe went through this. Europe went from a Judeo-Christian past, right, Catholic, Protestant with Jewish neighborhoods, and then Europe went into a secular neutral with the French Revolution. And Napoleon spreading this French secularism, hey, anything goes, free sex, LGBT, and now Europe is entering an Islamic future. So in a sense, all the gay agenda is a creative transition phase to cut ties with the Christian past before it's quickly co-opted by an Islamic future. And so we need to get our memory back. And there's approximately 6,000 years of recorded human history. Out of all my years of studying history, I found this fascinating. Writing was invented around 3,000 or 4,000 BC. Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. It's the beginning of writing. And then Egyptian hieroglyphics were invented around 3,000 BC. And Chinese characters were invented around 2600 BC with the Yellow Emperor on bamboo annal books. But you round it out, writing was invented around 3,000 or 4,000 BC. We're around 2080. That's around 5,000 or 6,000 years of recorded history. Here's what Franklin Roosevelt said: 5,000 years of recorded history have proven that mankind has always believed in God in spite of the many abortive attempts to exile God. Here's a quote from Richard Overy, editor of the Times Complete History of the World. He said, "No date appears before the start of human civilizations around 5,500 years ago and the beginning of a written history." James Wilson signed the Declaration and the Constitution and was put on the Supreme Court by George Washington. Pretty smart guy. He said, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they should live. He's a pretty smart guy, and he's mentioning a 6,000-year number. Here's Daniel Webster. "Miracles do not cluster, and what has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there'll be anarchy throughout the world." Again, 6,000 years. And so 6,000 years is not that long. It's only 60 people living 100 years each back to back. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years? Maybe a grandmother, close to it anyway. We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. But it's been a 6,000-year quest to rule the world. So we got these 6,000 years of records. Let's read through them. What do they show? They show that power keeps wanting to concentrate into the hands of one person. And the Bible tells the story of Nimrod in the Tower of Babel. And the Jewish commentator Josephus says that Nimrod wanted to build the tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. So it sort of had this defiant, in-your-face attitude. God came down, confuses the languages, and the people, what? Scatter. So we see the first illustration of concentrated power and separated power. Everybody hold up a fist in one hand, say concentrated power, concentrated power. Then your fingers apart with the other, say separated power, separated power. Then back to the fist, concentrated power. That is world history. For most of world history, power is in the hands of the pharaohs and Caesars and Nimrods and tyrants and kings. Very rarely do people get an opportunity to stretch the rubber band and experiment with ruling themselves without a king. But in times of crises, the rubber band snaps back. And he was sort of like the Terminator, that movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And there's this killer robot from the future that's chasing after him, and they blow it to pieces, and everybody's relieved. And then the pieces melt into little silvery balls, and they begin to roll together into the silvery pool. And out of it comes the hand of this Terminator. Then it climbs out and starts chasing him again. It's like, how do we get rid of this? It's like God confused the languages, and the power scattered. But every generation that wants to come back. And so every generation has its version of a Nimrod. Right? A Caesar, a Pharaoh, a Kaiser, and they want to rebuild this power structure. You know, here's Augustus Caesar, the most powerful leader in the world, and what does he do? He wants to have a global census. He wants to have an NSA. He wants to track everybody whose lives he controls. And so, anyway, so we see 2,000 years, 33 major Egyptian dynasties ruled by pharaohs. They own the people, the cattle, the land. Sargon of Akkad conquered from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus of Persia, Darius, Alexander the Great, Roman emperors, Byzantine emperors, Muslim sultans, Chandragupta in India, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan. Pick a century, you're going to read about kings. And people say, we don't have kings anymore. Well, there is El Presidentes and Muslims, Saudi kings. But you think of it, communism and socialism is nothing more than monarchy. Think, what? Yeah, think every communist and socialist country has a dictator. Right? Hitler was the head of the National Socialist Workers' Party, and the Soviet Union, United Soviet Socialist Republic, so Stalin, right? And so socialism and communism, you always have a dictator. Or Stalin, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Mao Zedong, and the Communist Party members are the new royalty. They get to live in the nice houses, special shops, special neighborhoods, and the people are the peasants, the subjects under the thumb of the king. And so students will say, well, I thought communism was everybody owned everything equally. It's like, let's think a little deeper. Who decides who lives in the nice house and who lives in the dumpy house? Somebody in the government dictates those things. Well, whoever ultimately dictates those things is the dictator, right? So power wants to concentrate. It's like the pull of a magnet, like the law of gravity. It's like the movie The Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf tells Frodo, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. And I think it goes back to the fall in the garden and selfishness coming into the human DNA, and Cain killing Abel, and one king taking a kingdom from another king. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one of them takes the rattle from the others. You put some kids on a playground, one of them is the bully hogging the ball. You put some junior high girls in a clique, and one of them is the diva. You put some natives in the woods, one of them's the Indian chief. You put them in an inner city, one of them's the gang leader. And all a king is, in a sense, is a glorified gang leader. And it's a hierarchical system. So if you are friends with the king, you are more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you are less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're dead or you're a slave. It's called treason, right? And so this is the norm for world history. The social structure is like a pyramid. The king on top, the pharaoh, and those that kiss up to him, and then he's got his military to enforce his will, and the slaves are at the bottom. And so they would call it the divine right of kings. And so the Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be the son of the god Osiris. The Chinese emperors claimed to have a mandate from heaven. The Assyrian Babylonians were king priests. The Indian Maharajas were semi-divine. The Roman emperors claimed to be divine, demanded their image be worshipped. The Incan emperors claimed to be delegates of the sun god. The Japanese emperors, you couldn't even look up at the floor at their face. But then they Christianized it in Europe and called it the divine right of kings. God chose me to be the king, so whatever my will is must be God's will because he put me here. So I can pretty well do anything I want. And if you're challenging me, you're challenging God, so I'm going to squash you. Anyway, that's the norm. Here's Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. He's called Sun King because his subjects were planets that revolved around him. He was the center of his universe. And he says, I am the state. Another place he says, it is legal because I wish it. Well, that's easy. The law is nothing more than the king's will forced down the throat on everybody, right? I got my pen and my phone. I'm just going to do what I want. And so we see that here's James I saying, kings are God's lieutenants upon earth, sit upon God's throne. The king is the overlord of the whole land, masters over every person, having power over the life and death of everyone. And so it took centuries before America was given the chance to break away from a king. And so the 1500s, the most powerful kings are the King of Spain, Charles V, head of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Muslim Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, head of the Ottoman Empire. And so a little background on the Sultan, Islam. It starts with Muhammad. He was a religious leader from the pagan city of Mecca in 610 AD, and he only makes 70 converts in 12 years. He gets confrontational, and the people of Mecca chase him out of town for disturbing the peace. He has nowhere to go. He is a Muslim refugee. Muhammad goes north 210 miles to a Jewish city called Medina. They're nice and tolerant. they let Muhammad in as a Muslim immigrant. He goes into the minority neighborhoods, and he finds those that have grievances against the Jewish government, and he organizes them into a group, right? We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community, right? He gets a following. He pressures the Jews to accommodate him and his followers politically. And they do. Now Muhammad's a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then when Muhammad's followers are chased out of Mecca for being argumentative and confrontational, they have nowhere to go. They're Muslim refugees. They go to Medina. The Jews let them in as immigrants. And Muhammad allows his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town, and he ends up becoming a military leader. Muhammad fights in 66 battles and raids, kills 3,000 people, and beheads 700 Jews in Medina. And so within 5 years of him coming into the Jewish city as an immigrant, there's not a Jew left in the city. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved, and then they begin to conquer. So he concentrates power not just militarily and politically, but religiously. He wants your thoughts, right? And so we see that the Muslims conquer Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom. They conquer Jerusalem, which had been a Byzantine Christian city for 3 centuries. They conquer Syria, which was the first country to completely be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria. And then Muslims conquer Egypt, which had been evangelized by Mark, that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then they conquer North Africa. There used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century. Boom, all conquered. And then they invade into Persia. And so this happens just within 23 years of Muhammad's death. Cuts off trade across the Mediterranean, and Rome's economy craters. Sort of like today, if China held their ships back for a couple months, all of our Walmart shelves would be empty. And so then they invade Spain in the year 711. Muslims are on Arabian horses with stirrups. The Europeans are still fighting on foot. In 10 years, the Muslims conquer all of Spain. They're finally stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. They go from Arabia to Paris in a 100-year military campaign. And since this is the first century of Islam, Muslims that want to be better Muslims, they view that century as the pure example of how they're supposed to act. The same way Christians look back to our first century, and we see Jesus and the apostles and the early church as our example of how we're supposed to act. Then they come around the other side of the Mediterranean and invade into what is today Turkey. Back then, it was the Byzantine Christian Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. Ephesus, Colossae, Galatia, all these letters in the New Testament to cities, right? Philippi, those cities were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. The Muslims conquer so much that the Greek Christians begged the West for help. Now, the Greek Christians thought they were the true Christians because they spoke the language of the New Testament. Their land was where John spoke and Paul spoke. And so they had to beg the church split to come back, right? The Catholic Church had split away in 1054 AD. And so they sent help, and it's called the Crusades. That's what the Crusades were. And then finally, the Crusades end. The Muslims conquer Constantinople, cutting off the land routes to India. And that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route. Columbus would have never set sail over here if it had not been for a jihad over there. Finally, in the 1500s, Sultan Suleiman controls this huge area that used to be Christian. North Africa, Egypt, the Holy Land, the Middle East, into Turkey, and into Eastern Europe. Again, his counterpart is the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V of Spain. We're talking kings. These are the 2 most powerful kings. Charles V controls Spain, Austria, the Spanish Netherlands, Italy, all the New World. He's taken the gold from the New World to arm his navy to fight the Muslims from taking over Europe. And then the Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. So again, the 2 most powerful kings on the planet. And then the Reformation starts in 1517. And then in 1529, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna under Suleiman the Magnificent. So Charles V is really stuck. He's got a problem with the Reformation and the Muslim invasion. Martin Luther says the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk's God, the devil, is not beaten first, there is reason to fear the Turk will not be so easy to beat. John Calvin writes, I hear the sad condition of your Germany. The Turk again prepares to wage war with a larger force. Who will stand up to oppose his marching throughout the land at his mere will and pleasure? John Wesley wrote, ever since the religion of Islam appeared in the world, espousers of it have been as wolves and tigers to all other nations, rending and tearing all that fell into their merciless paws. 2 centuries before the Reformation, Thomas Aquinas wrote, Muhammad seduced the people by promises of carnal pleasure. Those who believed in him were brutal men and desert wanderers. Muhammad forced others to become his followers by the violence of his arms. And so Charles V, again, he's Catholic, he's faced with this double dilemma, Protestant Reformation on one hand and the Muslim invasion on the other, so he decides to strike a deal with the Protestants. It's called the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. And it has a little phrase in this treaty that had enormous repercussions. The phrase was, cuius regio, eius religio, which means, whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these Muslims who are invading Europe because they want to kill us all. And so it worked. It stopped the Muslim invasion. But in the next century, it started a domino effect where different kings decided to believe different things. So northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran, Switzerland, Calvinist, Scotland, Presbyterian, Holland, Dutch Reformed, Greece was Greek Orthodox, Russia was Russian Orthodox, England was Anglican, and of course Spain, Portugal, France, Austria, Italy, Poland, Ireland remained Catholic. So prior to the Muslim invasion, it was all Catholic. After the Muslim invasion and the Peace of Augsburg, you got to believe different things. It's all divided up. But the problem was, what the king believed, the kingdom had to believe. It was one Christian denomination per country. And if you did not believe the way your king did, you were persecuted and you were burned at the stake or you fled. And so we see this mass migration in the 1600s and wars taking place in Europe and people migrating and spilling over and founding colonies in America. Well, let's look at England. It had a king, Henry VIII. He's married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the King of Spain. Pretty important girl. After 18 years, she does not have a son. A daughter Mary, but not a son. So Henry decides to divorce her. The Pope won't recognize the divorce because she is, after all, the daughter of the most powerful guy in the world. And so Henry decides he's going to make himself his own Pope. He starts the Church of England, puts himself on as the head, and he goes on to have 6 wives. And their fates were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So Henry VIII was not a really nice guy to be married to. His advisors, are you still with me? His advisors suggested if he really wanted to break with Rome, he should stop using that old Latin Bible, get himself an English Bible. He thinks it's a good idea, spreads the English Bible around the country. But something unexpected happened. People began to read it and began to compare what's in this Bible to this king divorcing and beheading his wives and claiming to be the head of the church. And so a group started that wanted to purify the Church of England. They were nicknamed the Puritans. Well, the king didn't think he needed purifying. And so he persecuted this group. He had an Archbishop, William Laud, who would send spies into the churches and listen to the sermons of the pastors. And if they didn't follow the Anglican liturgy, the pastor was arrested. And you read the story of Alexander Layton, right? He was brought into the Star Chamber, right? This secret chamber where they drill him and torture him. And so he was ordered to have his nose cut in half, his ears cut off, branded on the face as a heretic with SL, seditious libel, whipped twice, put in the Tower of London until he died. It was a dangerous thing to believe the Bible differently than what the government wants you to believe. And while there's another group that said it's beyond hope of trying to purify the Church of England, we're going to separate ourselves. And they would meet in secret in barns and basements by candlelight. And yes, they were snitched on and they were captured and persecuted. They decided to flee to Holland. And we call them the Pilgrims. And they're in Holland for several years until they flee to America. And so here's what King James I said. He demanded religious conformity or he would harry them out of the land. You got to believe the way I tell you to believe. And so the Pilgrims were going to land in Jamestown, which was a royal colony right underneath the king's thumb, but they got blown off course. And it's winter and stormy, and the captain says, it is too dangerous. You are going to spend the winter here in Massachusetts. And they said, well, there's not only no buildings, there's like no government. And they said, who's going to be in charge? You see, the problem was there was no king-appointed person on their boat. The whole world is kings. Now, there's 3 types of colonies. The first was a company colony, the Virginia Company, and it had bylaws that the king approved. And then there was a royal crown colony. So Jamestown was a company colony, goes bankrupt, they throw it in the king's lap. He sends over a royal governor who rules it underneath of him. And then there's what they call proprietary colonies. The whole thing is given as property to one person. So William Penn got all of Pennsylvania as his property. Lord Baltimore got all of Maryland as his property. But it's the king deciding who's going to run this colony in his stead. Well, when the Pilgrims land, there's no king-appointed person on their boat. Who's going to be in charge? They do something unique. They decide to grant themselves the authority. It's called the Mayflower Compact. It's the first constitution written in the New World. It says, we, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic. These are Christians forming a political body. And to enact just and equal laws, as shall be thought most meet, unto which we promise all due submission. Simple, revolutionary. The whole rest of the world, it's the creator, the king, and him dispensing it and deciding who's going to be in charge. And this is them giving themselves the authority, right? it it starts off, our U.S. Constitution drew from this. It starts off, we the people, right? And the word federal is Latin for covenant. We have a covenant form of government, goes all the way back to the Pilgrims Mayflower Compact. So we begin to see a transition from a top-down form of government with a king, a dictator, or an El Presidente, right, to a bottom-up form of government. And so it's the difference between a pyramid that's dead and a living oak tree. And every cell, the roots, the little capillary roots, they're all drawing nutrients, keeping this thing alive. It's a form of government where every single citizen participates in keeping this thing alive. And so where did the pastors get this idea? From their pastor, John Robinson. There he is, painted. He's kneeling on the deck of the boat. And then there's the open Bible held by Elder William Brewster. This painting is in our U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. And so New England, out of the whole entire world, is where a unique little greenhouse experiment takes place. The rest of the world, it's kings and pharaohs and Caesars with armies conquering. This is pastors and their communities, churches founding communities. So Puritans, remember them? They're in England getting their nose cut in half and their ears cut off. The Puritans flee in 1630. Like 20 or 30,000 of them, they flee and they come to America. And something happens. In England, they did not like the king telling them how to have church. Once they got here, there were so many of them, they thought, we sort of are the government. Maybe it's not such a bad thing that the government tell the church how to have church, because we're in charge of the government. And then there's this pastor named John Lothrop, and he says, no, the government's not supposed to tell us how to have church. He and his church flee, and they found Barnstable, Massachusetts. And then there's Reverend Roger Williams, right? He's in England. He's writing these pamphlets that say things like, if the king can stand there and answer for your conscience on the day of judgment, fine, believe whatever the king tells you to believe. But if the king's not going to be there on the day of judgment, you are accountable to God for your own conscience. Well, the king didn't like these type of pamphlets, so he's persecuted, he flees, he comes to Massachusetts. So here's Roger Williams saying, government shouldn't tell us how to have church. And they go to him and say, didn't you get the memo over here? We're sort of in the majority. We sort of are telling the church how to have church. He goes, no. Well, they chase him out. He flees and founds Providence, Rhode Island, and the first Baptist church in America. And then there's Reverend Roger Wheelwright. And he and his church flee, and they found Exeter, New Hampshire. Then there's Reverend Thomas Hooker, and he was upset because the Puritans said only Puritans could vote, and he said every Christian should be able to vote. And so he says, okay, church, next Saturday, meet in the parking lot, get your wagons and your cows, and we're going to leave. And they go through the wilderness, and they find an area, chop down trees, make peace with the Indians, and they name it Hartford, Connecticut. And so this is 50 years before Europe's Age of Enlightenment. Right? You read a lot of the secular writers. Well, America's founders got all their ideas from the Age of Enlightenment. This is 50 years before that. All right? So this is a pastor and his church, and they flee. And so the members of his church come to Reverend Thomas Hooker and say, Pastor, how do we do the government thing? And he gives a sermon in 1638. And in it, he says, the foundation of authority is laid firstly in the free consent of the people. This is revolutionary. Why? Because the rest of the world, the foundation of authority, Creator giving the power to the king who dispenses it to the people. This is the people, right, that decide. He says the privilege of election belongs to the people, according to the blessed will and law of God. They who have the power to appoint officers and magistrates, it is also in their power also to set the bounds and limitations of the power. His sermon is written down, and it's called The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It is the Constitution for Connecticut from 1639 up until 1818. They're using the pastor's sermon as their state constitution. Historian John Fisk called it the first written constitution in history, became a blueprint for the other New England colonies. That's why Connecticut's called the Constitution State. They even have it on their license plate. And so here's a plaque in England. It says, Thomas Hooker, founder of the state of Connecticut, father of American democracy. Did you know that a pastor is considered the father of American democracy? Here's another plaque in England. Thomas Hooker, Puritan clergyman, reputed father of American democracy. And so his statue holding a Bible is at the Capitol in Hartford, Connecticut. At the base of the statue, it says, leading his people through the wilderness. At Hartford, 1636, on this site, he preached the sermon which inspired the fundamental orders. It was the first constitution that created a government. And then another plaque there in Hartford. Year of the Lord, 1638, Thomas Hooker preached his famous sermon. The foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people. And then in 1639, they passed the fundamental orders of Connecticut. In the fundamental orders, it says, where a people are gathered together, the word of God requires that to maintain peace, there should be an orderly and decent government established according to God. The people conjoin ourselves to be as one public state or commonwealth. Sort of like the Mayflower. We, covenant together to form a civil body politic. So here's form one public stater to preserve the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus, which we now profess. The governor shall administer justice according to the laws here established, and for want thereof, according to the rule of the word of God. I love it. The governor is supposed to enforce these laws, and if there's something we don't have a law on, just follow the Bible, right? The rule of the word of God. So in New England, it was unique because instead of separation of church and state, it was the pastors and their churches that created the state. How could you tell these pastors that they're not supposed to be involved in government when it's the pastor's sermon that created the government? You're right? I mean, how can you tell them that? And so here's Calvin Coolidge. He says, the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man. In order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action, whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. And so I read through every charter of every colony. Did you know every colony was started by a different Christian denomination? Virginia was Anglican. Right, all the way up to 1786, it was established Anglican. Mandatory membership, mandatory taxes. You couldn't hold office unless you were Anglican. Matter of fact, this is in 1624. The Virginia Assembly, their government, passes this. Whosoever shall absent himself from divine service any Sunday without an allowable excuse shall forfeit a pound of tobacco. We missed you on church. Where's the tobacco, right? Better sit in that same seat every Sunday, right? And in Massachusetts, it was established Puritan. New York was established Dutch Reformed. Maryland was originally established by Catholics, Lord Baltimore, and then it was taken over by the Anglicans. New Jersey was Swedish Lutheran. Gustav Adolphus of Sweden sends over a bunch, right? Then it's taken over by the Dutch, taken over by the British. Delaware was Swedish Lutheran. Rhode Island was founded by Baptists, Roger Williams. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, a Quaker. He had an interesting idea. He had been persecuted and put in the Tower of London for 8 months because he was a Quaker and not following the King's Anglican Church. And he comes to America, and he decides to do an experiment. And he wants to see if Christians of different denominations can live together in the same geographic area. Wow, what a unique thought, right? Their attitude back then was, if you don't like our denomination, fine, start your own colony. But he wanted to say, hey, let's see if we can live. Georgia was a plain Protestant. Connecticut was Congregation. Remember Thomas Hooker? And then New Hampshire, Carolina. I could go through all the rest of them. But what happened was the revolution starts. And they all have to work together against the king. After the revolution, their attitude was, we may not agree on religion all the time, but you were willing to fight and die for my freedom. I need to let you practice your faith. They began to tolerate each other. First, it was tolerance for the denomination that started the colony. Then it went out to Protestants. 98% of the country was Protestant. At the time of the revolution, 3 million people, there were 98% Protestant, 1% Catholic. Catholics were only allowed in 3 states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York. And there's only 1,500 Jews, just 0.5%. And there are only 7 synagogues in the whole country. Anyway, so first it was tolerance for the denomination. Then it went to Protestants. Then it went to Catholics. And then it went out to liberal Christian denominations. Then it went out to Jews and monotheist policies. And finally, the atheists. And the last ones in kicked the first ones out. So everybody's tolerated in America except the Christians that founded the country, right? They're not content with coming out of the closet. They want to shove you into it. And so it's like a lifeboat with persecuted people, and the lifeboat comes, and they pull in the Puritans, and then they pull in Protestants, and they pull in Catholics and Jews, and finally the boat's getting crowded. Then they finally pull in the atheists, and the atheist says, this boat's too crowded, and they shove out the Christian. And anyway, so now pastors founded colonies, right? There's 2 different views that the pastors had. One view for the first century of America was the Calvinist Puritan view, which is God has a plan for your life, your marriage, your family, your church, and your government. Dig in the scripture, find out what the plan is, put it into place. Simple. Second is a pietist view. Now remember Martin Luther had a personal revelation that the just shall live by faith. Very personal to him. But some princes wanted to break away from Rome, and they said, this is my chance, kingdom of mine, you're all now Lutheran. And the people say, okay, we're Lutheran. No, what do we believe? So for the people in those kingdoms, it was not necessarily the same personal experience that Martin Luther had. And so a revival movement starts called pietism. And it says, look, being a Christian is more than just agreeing with doctrine. You have to have a personal experience with Jesus. And when you do, your life should change. and you'll no longer hang around the worldly people you used to in the bars, in the brothels, in the theater, in the government. Wait, what was that last thing? Yeah, there's worldly people in government, so if you're really a Christian, you're not going to be involved in government. Right? The ultimate of that is the Amish, right? They're like, we don't want to vote. And so these two competing views are seen by two brothers. And they are pietist Lutheran pastors. Their dad started the Lutheran Church in America, Henry Muhlenberg. And so we got John Peter and Frederick Augustus. John Peter hears Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty, give me death" speech. And then he goes to George Washington, who was there, and he says, I want to help. Washington says, fine, I'm going to make you a colonel. Go get your men. So he goes to church, and he preaches a sermon. There's a time for all things, time to gather stones, time to scatter stones, out of Ecclesiastes. And then he says there's a time to preach and a time to fight. And he takes off his clerical robe, and underneath, he's wearing a uniform of a continental officer. And he has an altar call. 300 men of his church come forward. They kiss their wives goodbye. They ride off to become the 8th Virginia Regiment. They fight in all kinds of battles. He's promoted to major general. Then afterwards, he's elected to Congress. And he is there in the first session of Congress where they pass the First Amendment. His brother, Frederick, is a pietist pastor in New York. He's writing letters to his brother, John Peter, saying, you have become too involved in matters which, as a preacher, you have nothing whatsoever to do. And John Peter writes back accusing Frederick of being a Tory British sympathizer. Frederick writes back, says he could not serve two masters, and they're going back and forth. And then finally the British bombard New York City. They burn Frederick's church. His wife and kids have to flee. And then he decides, maybe we do need to get involved. Right? They're burning the church. Right? And so he gets involved and becomes a congressman, and he's elected the first Speaker of the House. The first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives is Lutheran pastor Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. And what do they pass in that first session of Congress? The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, right, which includes the First Amendment. There's two signatures on the Bill of Rights, John Adams and Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. Well, does anybody honestly think that these two pastor congressmen would vote to outlaw themselves? Would they say pastors and people of faith should not get involved in government when we are pastors and we are people of faith and we are involved in government? They're the ones that passed. One of them is the Speaker of the House. No, clearly the First Amendment, the first 10 amendments were handcuffs on the federal government to keep it from becoming a big King George III monster, right? And we know that because the preamble of the Bill of Rights says to prevent the federal government from abusing its powers, certain restrictive clauses shall be placed on it. And so the Bill of Rights are nothing more than handcuffs on the federal government. And that's why it says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or nor taking away the right to freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of right to trial by peers, freedom of right to possess and bear arms. Congress shall not, Congress shall not, Congress. These are the 13 states saying, okay, federal government's like playing cards. We're going to give you a couple cards, provide for the common defense, regulate interstate commerce. We're going to keep all the rest of the cards, right? And so if they would have seen ahead that the Supreme Court would make laws, they would have said Congress and the Supreme Court shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. If they would have seen ahead that the president would make laws through executive orders and through regulations and wanted to put into the Affordable Care Act that little nuns have to pay for contraception, they would have said Congress and the Supreme Court and the president shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Anyway, religion was under states' jurisdiction, and they were very jealous of it. And their fear was the federal government would choose one denomination, make it the national, which is what every country in Europe did. And so the religion under states' jurisdiction, I read through every state constitution. Did you know 9 of the original state constitutions required you to be a Protestant Christian to hold state office? Here's South Carolina's 1778 Constitution. The Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed the established religion of the state. John Adams wrote the Massachusetts Constitution. I declare I believe the Christian religion have a firm persuasion of its truth. Legislature shall authorize support and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety and religion. So it's like a racetrack with 13 lanes. Religion was under states' jurisdiction. Sort of like today, some states have smoking bans and others don't. Some states have underage drinking, others don't. Some states have legalized marijuana, others don't. Some states have gambling and prostitution, like Nevada. Thank God the rest don't. Back then, before the 1947 Everson case, religion was under states' jurisdiction. Some states gave a little more religious freedom. Some states had blue laws where everything's closed on Sunday. It's up to the people in the states to decide. Then there's an Irish potato famine. Millions of Irish Catholics come across. They end up getting tolerated. And so you see on South Carolina's Constitution changes it from Protestant to Christian in 1835. And then there's a persecution of Jews, Bavaria. They come across. And Maryland changes the Constitution from requiring you to be a Christian to saying you could also be a Jew if you believe in the future state of rewards and punishments. Connecticut changes from the fundamental orders to saying every denomination of Christians shall have equal rights. Then it said this: enjoyment of religious profession shall not excuse acts of licentiousness. What's that? Sexual immorality. Yeah, you have this freedom, but you can't use this freedom for sexual immorality, like having multiple wives. We face that, with the Utah situation. And so now it's switched where the only ones that get the freedom are the ones that are doing the licentious stuff. Anyway, here's the Washington State Constitution, 1889. We, the people of the state of Washington, grateful to the supreme ruler of the universe, right? And so in New England, they had this idea that the kingdom of God could never be forced from the top down. They were from Europe, where kings were burning people at the stake for not believing the way the king did. And they saw in scriptures that Jesus never forced anybody to believe in him. And they thought, if Jesus didn't force them, we can't force them. And so if the kingdom of God cannot be forced from the top down, how's it going to happen? They thought if the majority of the people held godly values and elected representatives with their values, then laws would be passed reflecting those values, and the values of the kingdom could come voluntarily from the bottom up rather than forced from the top down. Do you see it? Instead of the creator, the king, the people, now it's the creator giving the rights directly to the people, and they choose their leaders from amongst themselves. Now, where did the people get this idea? Well, they got some ideas from England's Magna Carta, and Rome had a republic with 600 senators until Julius Caesar found a way to usurp power and make himself dictator for life. They did get some ideas from Athens, which had a democracy, and until Alexander the Great's dad bribed citizens of Athens with gold under the table, and they betrayed their own city. But they ultimately got the idea of people ruling themselves from ancient Israel. What do I mean? Well, the U.S. Constitution was written, but it needed to be ratified by the states. They needed 9 states. They had 8. New Hampshire was in line to be the 9th, but it was in a deadlock at its ratifying convention. So Harvard President Samuel Langdon gives an address, the Republic of the Israelites, an example to the American states. Instead of the 12 tribes of Israel, we may substitute the 13 states of the American Union. And so after this sermon, they vote and ratify it. They're the 9th state. The U.S. Constitution goes into effect. The U.S. Constitution went into effect after this sermon. What was the Republic of the Israelites? Well, around 1400 BC, Israel comes out of Egypt. Who controlled everything in Egypt? The Pharaoh. And the people, the cattle of the land. Children of Israel come into the promised land. Those first 400 years, there is no king. Everyone is equal before the law. And the law says there is no respect of persons in judgment, rich or poor, everyone's the same, male, female, made in the image of the Creator. This is the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. That everyone you see is equal to you. There's no royal family to butter up next to, right? There's no caste system that you were born and stuck in. There's no your worth is dependent on your utility and usefulness. No, your worth is you're made in the image of God. It's the beginning of the concept of equality. Ancient Israel is the first nation with private land ownership. You see, wherever there's a king, you never really own the land. It is always conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. You cross the king, he will take away the land and kill you. In Israel, the land was permanently titled to the families. If they got in a pinch and sold it every 50 years, the land reverted back to the family. This prevented a dictator from gathering up the land and putting the people back into slavery. Now, if you own land, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called it being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist. You got capital, you worked hard, you saved it. They call it promised land because the people got title to the land. Ancient Israel was the first nation with no police. Everyone was taught the law. Everyone enforced the law. Like everybody was deputized. Ancient Israel had no standing army. You have a king. He has an army to enforce his will. In Israel, every man was in the militia and armed and ready at a moment's notice to defend his family and his community. Ancient Israel had no prisons. Remember Joseph wasting away in prison in Egypt? In Israel, the law says immediate justice at the gate of a city, and then a city of refuge you could run away to. Ancient Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. Remember Egyptians selling their soul to the Pharaoh for a handout of grain? Well, in Israel, when someone harvested their field, they left the gleanings for the poor people to pick through. This way, the poor were taken care of without some political leader collecting everything and doling it back out to those who can help them stay in power. Ancient Israel had a system of honesty. God hates unjust weights and measures, so you can begin to trust people you do business with, became a basis for commerce. And ancient Israel, they got to choose their own leaders. Really? Yeah. Moses spake unto the children of Israel, saying, how can I alone bear your burden? Take you, wise men, and understanding, and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. He didn't go out among 3 million people and say, you. He said, no, take you, wise men, known among your tribes. So the tribe would get together, okay, who do you want? It was an election. And so anyone could be raised up into leadership. Gideon from a nobody family, here's Deborah, becomes a leader in Israel. Not because she's related to a Pharaoh, but because she knows the law, she's honest, the reputation spreads, people make their way all the way across the country. She sits under a tree and decides their cases. Where else could a woman that's not related to any royalty become a leader? And so ancient Israel is the first nation that could read. I found this really fascinating. So in Sumeria, they had 1,500 cuneiform characters. And I don't know about you, but memorizing 1,500 anything is pretty complicated. But it was only for the kings and the scribes. Right? It was an accounting method for the king to keep track of everything they owned. The first invention ever was the plow. Cain was a tiller of the soil. And then people started hitting each other with it. They turned into weapons. And then people gravitated together for protection. And when you get people together, someone is the one to sort of tell everybody else what to do. And it's good because you defend yourself and live. But then this person has kids and grandkids who claim to be an elite class. And it turns into a heretical monarchy. And it's basically just, we call it civilization, but it's basically gangs. Right? And so these kings claimed to own everything, and they wanted scribes to count it. So in China, the emperors had accountants that had knots and ropes. That's how they began to count. And like Sumeria, they had abacus with rods and beads that slid back and forth. Well, then Sumeria had tokens in dishes. And so they'd have a warehouse. How much is in the warehouse? Well, they got this little dish with some tokens in it. Then they made markings in the tokens. Have you ever tallied where you draw the lines 1, 2, 3, 4, then a line across for 5? That was the beginning of writing. And they had 1,500 of these characters. It was just for the kings and their scribes. And then in Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters, only for the pharaohs and their scribes. The scribes kept the hieroglyphs complicated on purpose as job security. It was their secret knowledge. And China had 10,000 characters just for court records. And so when you are a king or a dictator and you want to dominate people, you want the people to be ignorant. Sort of like a Common Core type of education where they go through the motions, but you want them coming out not being able to think critically, just practice behavior modification stuff. And so in Maryland and Virginia, prior to the Civil War, they actually had laws making it a crime to teach slaves to read. Frederick Douglass, the Republican advisor to Lincoln, he grew up on some Democrat plantation, right? And the slave master's sister-in-law was teaching him the alphabet. The slave master walks in, yells at her, and says, "Don't you dare teach slaves to read. They'll grow discontent and run away." Right? So here's anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss. Ancient writing's main function was to facilitate the enslavement of other human beings. So when Moses came down the mountain, he had the law, not in 1,500 characters or 3,000 or 10,000. He had the law in a 22-character alphabet. It was so easy to learn. Children could learn how to read. Ancient Israel is the first instance in world history where everyone could read. And not only could they read, they were required to read because the law was addressed to each person. And Margaret Thatcher says the Ten Commandments are the origin of the sanctity of the individual is personal liberty with personal responsibility. Every individual is personally responsible for this. Harry Truman, the fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the Mount. If we don't have a proper fundamental moral background, we'll finally end up with a totalitarian government which does not believe in rights for anybody except the state. So it's a spectrum of power. Remember, we did that already. So one side is total government. The other side is no government. And total government, you get a king. No government's anarchy. All right? And so power corrupts, absolute. Power corrupts, absolutely. You think, oh, you really? Think of it. Think if you got to be the king, and you're going to be really fair. And then you have a sister with a teenage son that drinks and drives and parties and hits somebody with the car and kills them. Now this teenager's facing manslaughter, life imprisonment, and your sister comes begging to you and says, "You're not going to let my little Johnny get locked away the rest of his life. It wasn't his fault. Those other kids talked him into it, blah, blah, blah." What are you going to say to your sister? "I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again." Guess what? As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just sent ripples through your kingdom that if you're family or friends with the king, you get a little special treatment. And if you're not family or friends, you don't get it. And if you're enemy, he's going to be tempted to shut you up. And so as power concentrates, you can be guaranteed there's favoritism and corruption. So what's the opposite? Don't let it get concentrated. Well, how are you going to have order if there's nobody in charge? The people need to have virtue. What's that? It's individual morals and laws. It's like everybody running a behavioral software program. But now the thought is, why would you follow an internal moral or law? What would cause you to deny yielding to a selfish temptation? Ancient Israel had the key ingredient. A God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair. He will hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal. You know you can get away with it. Nobody's around. And then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country believes God is watching, he wants me to be fair, he's going to hold me accountable, everybody is motivated to follow these internal morals, and you can have complete order in society with no policeman following everybody around. Maximum liberty. Now, it only works with the God of the Bible. An Islamic Allah God says there's an infidel woman there, nobody's around, you can rape her, it's okay. The God of the Bible says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So, Democrat candidate for president, William Jennings Bryan, said, a religion which teaches personal responsibility to God gives strength to morality. There is a powerful restraining influence in the belief that an all-seeing eye scrutinizes every thought and word and act of the individual. William Lynn, first chaplain of the U.S. House, said, let my neighbor persuade himself that there is no God, and he will pick my pocket and break not only my leg but my neck. If there be no God, there is no future account. Reagan said, without God, there is no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. And so you get rid of this God, all you have is rules. Why? Follow them. Some will out of habit or social acceptance or fear of getting caught. Others are going to say, forget this. If there's no God, this life is all there is. Why should I follow these rules? And they're going to give in to their passions, their lusts, and they're going to begin to rob and steal and smash windows and setting buildings on fire and having mobs in the street all across the country. And then everybody's going to say, well, we need someone to come in with enough power to restore order. And so the president will send in his, militarized police, and they'll go house to house and collect everybody's guns. And yeah, they'll restore order. But when the dust settles, you'll have fundamentally transformed your country from the people ruling themselves from the bottom up back to a king ruling from the top down. And so the Israel situation, it worked as long as the priest taught it. But the dilemma is every kid is born with selfishness. It's sort of like every computer you buy is preloaded with a virus. And you have to immediately take it to some computer geek, the geek squad, and have them clean it off. It's like every kid is born preloaded with this selfishness, and they take him to the Levite and say, clean him up, recode him. And the Levite would say, okay, kid, you want to steal, don't steal. You want to lie, don't lie. You want to commit adultery, don't commit adultery. God's watching, going to hold you accountable. And so Israel's system worked as long as the priest taught it to every new generation. When the priest stopped teaching the law, it began to fall apart. And so here's Eli, the high priest, the main guy that's supposed to teach it. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent of meeting with the Lord. And then there's a story of a Levite with a graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. The tribe of Dan comes along, takes the graven image, and you're scratching your head. What's this Levite doing with a graven image? Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them? And then there's a story of a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite is to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with a woman he's not even married to. They're traveling, and so it shows he's not following the law, much less teaching it. And they're in a house surrounded by sodomites, something about that behavior that appears at the very last stages of a people ruling themselves. They're giving into their passions. And so then they're banging on the doors, and he shoves the poor girl out. She gets raped and dies. He chops her body in 12 pieces, sends it to the 12 tribes. They come together, kill the sodomites, and by the time you're grossed out, you read this line that says, every man did what was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priests had stopped teaching them what was right in the Lord's eyes. And the whole thing fell apart. They go to Samuel. They say, we want to be like all the other countries. We want a king. Samuel cries, and the Lord said, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And so they get King Saul, who turns around and kills most of the priests. Interesting story. Saul's pouting. My son made a league with David. Nobody cares about me. And Doeg the Edomite says, I care. I saw David get the sword of Goliath and some bread from those priests at the city of Nob. Saul says, bring him here. Turns to his men to kill him. The men hesitate. Doeg says, I'll kill him, and he kills them all. What just happened? Israel had been a republic, a form of government where each individual person is accountable to God to follow the law. And the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn somebody to die. All we got is one, Doeg. And the law says you get the elders of the city together. They hear the case. Well, we don't have the elders. We just got Saul. And they're like, hey, I'm accountable to God. I'm not going to just... But Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I will kill. Sort of reminds me of an Emperor Zhao in China, and he was overthrowing another emperor, and he wanted to see who was loyal to him. So he brings in a deer and says, "This is a horse." And the one general says, "That's not a horse, that's a deer." Well, he ends up getting that guy killed. It brings in another general. "That's not a deer, that's a horse." And then it kills him. Finally, another general comes in. Okay, the deer's a horse, right, And so the king wants you to suspend your common sense. He just wants you to obey. So if they says, "Okay, there's no more male and female," but look, from the beginning of creation, there's been male, female offspring. "Okay, we're going to persecute you, sue you, kick you out." And then somebody else says, "Okay, there's no more male and female." But there's always been, every living animal on earth is a male, female offspring, right? And from the whales to the wolves. And they go, "Okay, we're going to persecute your state. We're going to boycott and pull the sports games out and the concerts out." Finally, they're going to say, "Okay, king, there's no more male and female. The battle is whatever you want," right? The king wants your soul. He wants your common sense. He wants your reason. He wants you to become some kind of robot type thing to follow his will. He wants yes men. Yale President Ezra Stiles says the secular welfare of God's ancient people depended on their virtue, their religions, their observance of that covenant which Israel entered into with God. Did you ever see a crane, big high crane downtown putting up things? Where is your eye drawn to? Well, the arm way up in the air, but maybe that's like success and prosperity. And you don't notice it, but the other side of the crane is something very small that's important. It's a counterweight of virtue. So you have a person who's very successful, maybe a sports hero or a Hollywood hero or a businessman, and they're real successful. But if they don't have a counterweight of virtue, they fall over and give into some temptation and the drugs or whatever. A nation, the more prosperous and successful a nation is, the more they need a counterweight of self-control and virtue amongst their population, because if they don't have that, the whole thing falls over in a moment. And so Harvard President Samuel Langdon said the only government which had a proper claim to a divine establishment was so far from including the idea of a king that it was a high crime for Israel to ask to be like the other nations, and when they were thus gratified, it was rather as a punishment. You want a king? I'll give you a king. He's going to take away everything. So the most powerful king in the world was the King of England. He controlled his global empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, all of India, quarter of the world population right there. America decides we don't like the king thing. And so we take the power of a king, separate it into 3 branches, separate it at federal and state level, and tie up this federal Frankenstein with 10 handcuffs. All the Constitution is a bunch of hurdles to prevent the rubber band from snapping back into the hands of a king. And I love this quote from Eisenhower. The national government was the creature of the states. Yet today, the creature Frankenstein-like is determined to destroy the creators. And so who's the king in America? Well, you got to think for a second. Signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Moore, said, the magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. Chief Justice John Jay, the people are the sovereign of this country. Abraham Lincoln, the people of these United States are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts. Signer of the Constitution, James Wilson, sovereignty resides in the people. They have not parted with it. Grover Cleveland, sovereignty of 60 millions of free people is the working out of the divine right of man to govern himself, a manifestation of God's plan concerning the human race. Theodore Roosevelt, in no other place and at no other time has the experiment of government of the people, by the people, for the people, been tried on so vast a scale as here in our own country. So in America, the people are the king. We pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. The republic is the people are king, ruling through their representatives. In a democracy, the people individually, personally have to be at the market every day to talk politics. If you're not there, you're called an idiotus, right? So a democracy never got larger than a city. So that's why you had the Greek city-states. But a republic is you take care of your family and farm and have someone in your place that goes to the market and talks politics every day. They are your res publica. In the place out there, your representative. And so we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic. We're pledging allegiance to the fact that we're the king, ruling through our servants. So when somebody dishonors the flag, what they're saying is, I no longer want to be the king. So imagine visiting a king in the Old Testament, going through the streets of Jerusalem, you're witnessing murder, rape, crime, and you get into the king's chamber, and he's all worried, and he looks at you and says, did you see all that crime coming in here? I wish somebody would fix it. You reach over, tap him on the shoulder, say, excuse me, you're the king? This is your kingdom? They're your servants running wild? You're the one accountable to God to fix this? That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff going on, saying, I wish somebody would fix it. Hello, reach through the TV tube and tap you on the shoulder. You're the king. This is your kingdom. You're the one accountable to God to fix this mess. Romans 13, all authority has been set up by God. God allowed our founding fathers to set up the authority so the people are the king. The politicians are the servants of the king. Well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Since when does the king sit on his throne and say, can somebody tell me what I'm supposed to do here? It's like, dude, you're the one that's supposed to hear from God and you tell everybody else what to do, right? This is the way it's done. You look at nature, there's millions and gazillions of things and everything does its own little part to keep this world alive. God has got something for every single person to do. He wants to equip you. Anyway, James Wilson said, every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power. He possesses a vote. Not to vote is to abdicate the throne. And so someone say, well, don't bother voting. Just sit out the election. Just trust God. Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull during the Revolution said, to trust altogether to the justice of our cause without our utmost exertion would be tempting providence. You do everything you can, then you trust God. So the most important thing is to bring people to Christ. The second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. If you're really convinced the gospel is the answer, you will be involved wanting to preserve the freedom to preach the gospel. If Sharia law Islam takes over, it is the death penalty to preach the gospel, right? Go to Saudi Arabia and try it. If North Korean communism takes over, you're tortured in a labor camp the rest of your life if you preach the gospel. And if the LGBT agenda has its way, look at the mayor of Houston wanting to censor all the sermons of the pastors. They're going to tell you what you can and cannot say about the gospel. If you're really convinced the gospel's the answer, you're going to be involved wanting to preserve the freedom to preach it. So those super spiritual places really say, oh, we don't get involved in politics. We're just going to preach the gospel. You know what? They really don't believe the gospel. Because if they really believed it, they'd want to preserve the freedom to be able to preach it. And so if the people are the king, who are the counselors to the king? This is where it gets interesting. So 379 AD, the Roman Empire is now Christian. Remember Constantine stopped the persecution of Christians in 313, and the Roman Empire became Christian. So here in 379, you have a Christian Roman emperor named Theodosius. He's going to church in Milan, Italy. And the pastor is Saint Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose. Could you imagine being Bishop Ambrose and having the emperor in your church on Sunday? Guess what? That's exactly what we have in America. The Pew Forum says that 70% of Americans identify themselves as Christian. 70%, I think that's a majority. I think they can swing an election any way, whatever they want. And since they're Christian, they're going to church. And the pastors of the country are speaking to the king every Sunday. And so the people are the king, the people in the churches. You ever see the movie The Lord of the Rings? There's this scene of a King Theoden, and he has a spell cast on him. He's decrepit, gray hair, gray eyes. He's just totally out of it. And he has two counselors in this scene. One is this ugly guy named Wormtongue, and he's whispering in his ear, saying, stay asleep, don't get involved. Yes, your kingdom is being overrun, and yes, you're the king, and you're responsible for all, but just go back to sleep. Soon it'll all be over. And there's another counselor that comes in and talks to the king named Gandalf, and he casts the devil out of him, and right before your eyes, the king starts to wake up. And he says, dark have been my dreams of late. It's like, yeah, you've been out of it. And then he says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword. And so the people in America are the king. And they've had one counselor that says, go to sleep, but another one, that's why I love your pastor so much, another one comes in with a bucket of ice water, throws it on his congregation, and says, wake up. You don't just have the right to vote in America. You will be held accountable to God for what happens in America. You're the king. Martin Luther King Jr. says the church is the conscience of the state. It's supposed to be addressing everything. I love this quote, Chief Justice John Jay. Americans are the first people whom heaven has favored with an opportunity of choosing the forms of government under which they live. All other constitutions have derived their existence from violence or accidental circumstances. Your lives, your liberty, your property will be at the disposal only of your Creator and yourselves. If I were to sum up the greatness of America, this is it. Your lives, your liberty, your property are at the disposal only of your Creator and yourselves. There's no king, pharaoh, dictator, sultan that's in between you. You get to, it's just you and your Creator. You get to decide. Reagan put it this way. In this country of ours took place the greatest revolution that has ever taken place in the world's history. Out of those 6,000 years, every other revolution simply exchanged one set of rulers for another. Here, for the first time, in all the thousands of years of man's relation to man, the founding fathers established the idea that you and I have within ourselves the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. Can you see it? Well, we need to turn back to God. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Persecution is increasing, and someday you're going to be dead. It's a nice way to end a service. But you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for your sins. There's crisis. You know, I found in times of crisis, people turn to Christ, and in times of crisis, God raises up leaders. But so some of you are going to be dead, and you're going to be in heaven because you believe Jesus died for your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun, imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years. You get a chance to meet Moses. That'd be pretty neat. Walking the streets of gold, Moses. Maybe Moses will invite you over to his place. I don't know what it's like in heaven. Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions. I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. Maybe like a big living room like the size of this room here today. And I bet he'll have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn out. Get at the burning bush, and the wilderness didn't burn up, and the logs in his fire. I heard one preacher say, in heaven, you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I said, I was thinking about something else. But imagine being there in Moses' living room, and after all the small talk, you tap him on the shoulder and say, Moses, tell us the story. What was it like? I mean, I read the book and I saw the movie, but here you are in person, right? Moses will stand up and the room will get quiet and say, I was 80 years old. And Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging in at us. And they had these brand new military invention of chariot wheels, right? That was a brand new thing. And they had these razor sharp swords, and we were totally unarmed. And I just stood there holding out my staff. I said, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to look around the room and see David. Say, David, tell us your story. And he'll say, well, I was just a teenager. And this thug, Goliath, was mocking our God and making fun of our faith. And these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything about it. And I said, enough of them. I don't know everything they know, but I got my little sling. I went out and hit him in the head and took his own sword and chopped his head off. We'll say, wow. Then we're going to see Gideon. Hey, Gideon, tell us your story. Gideon will say, well, it's 100,000 Midianites, and I was able to get 30,000 Israelites. And God said, tell everyone that's scared to go home. Now I'm down to 10,000. Still too many. Go drink from a creek, right? And whittles it down to 300. Now God says, watch this. God loves to wait until things look hopeless, and then he raises up little nobodies with faith and courage to do big things. So everybody's going to tell their story in Moses' place up there, right? And then everybody's going to look at you. So you tell us your story. What did you do when it was your turn to be on earth? What were they saying about God in your country? What were they saying about the baby that the Lord knew in the mother's womb? Or marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis, the man shall leave the father and mother and cleave to the wife, and the two shall become one? What did you do when the whole world was against you and they were smearing you and lying about you on the internet? What did you do? You know, I'd hate for any of us to be up there and have a big screen come down and all kinds of great things happen, and then Jesus walk in and say, you know what? This is what I had planned for you to do. If you'd have just had a little more faith. If you'd have just trusted me a little bit more, if you just had a little more courage, and realized, I can't go back, I can't do anything else for him because I'm already in heaven, because I believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for my sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. We still have feet that trod the soil. We still can do those things that you'll be known for forever. Moses is always going to be known to stand up to Pharaoh. David is always going to be known for standing up to Goliath. It's like a basketball game, and you got the bench, and the coach comes up and says, okay, time to get in the game. Slaps you on the back, and you're like, but coach, didn't you notice they're like sort of bumping into each other out there? They're playing tough. It's like, yeah, I know. I made you. I drafted you. You got what it takes to get in there. And it's like, but coach, oh, look, somebody fell down. Coach, look at, they're playing mean to each other. Yeah, I know. You're 7 feet tall. They're 4 feet tall. Now get in the game. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. Out of the 6,000 years, the good Lord decided you would be alive right now. He's given you his word. He's given you his spirit. He's given you a tremendous church, a tremendous pastor. He's given you it all. And go forth and do those things that you'll be known for forever. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you.